Picture this. Rome. The year is 67 AD. The imperial palace blazes with torchlight. Every marble column, every golden statue, every polished surface catches the flickering flames and throws them back, turning the vast ceremonial hall into a cathedral of fire and shadow. A wedding is taking place, an imperial wedding. The most powerful man in the world is taking a bride. Senators line the walls in their finest togas, purple striped and immaculate. Generals stand at attention, their dress armor gleaming. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protect the emperor's life, form an honor corridor leading to the raised platform where the ceremony will take place. Musicians play. The traditional Roman wedding hymn echoes through the space. Servants glide silently between the guests, offering wine in golden cups, delicacies on silver platters. The air is thick with incense, frankincense, myrrh, roses. Everything is perfect, everything is beautiful, and everything is wrong. You can see it in their faces, the senators who smile but whose eyes dart nervously to the exits, the generals whose jaws are clenched tight enough to crack teeth, the servants who keep their gazes fixed firmly on the floor, as if looking directly at what's happening might turn them to stone, because the bride is walking down the aisle now, and she is exquisite. She moves with practiced grace, each step perfectly measured. Her gown is silk, dyed the deep saffron yellow that Roman brides wear, embroidered with gold thread in patterns so intricate they must have taken months to create. Jewels catch the torchlight. Emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from Persia, pearls from the distant shores of Britannia. Her hair is arranged in the traditional 6 braids, wound with ribbons and flowers. Her face is painted with expert precision, kohl around the eyes to make them appear larger, rouge on the cheeks for that perfect, healthy glow, lips stained red with wine lees. She is beautiful, breathtaking even. But everyone in that room knows the truth. Everyone has heard the whispers that have been circulating through Rome for months, and now they're seeing it with their own eyes, forced to participate in something that makes their blood run cold. The bride is not a woman. The bride is a boy. A teenage boy, perhaps 19 or 20 years old. A boy who, 3 years ago, had a different name, a different body, a different life. A boy who was surgically altered, mutilated, to better resemble the emperor's dead wife. The Emperor Nero stands waiting at the altar. He's dressed in imperial purple, a crown of laurel leaves on his head. He's smiling. Not the forced political smile of a man performing a duty, a genuine smile. The smile of a man who believes, with absolute conviction, that he is marrying the woman he loves, the woman who has been dead for 2 years. As the bride reaches the platform, Nero takes her hand. His touch is gentle, reverent, almost worshipful. He looks into her eyes carefully made up to appear larger, more feminine, more like hers. And he sees what he wants to see. Poppaea Sabina, his beloved wife, returned to him. The priests begin the ceremony. The traditional vows are spoken, legal documents are signed, making this union official under Roman law. Witnesses step forward to confirm what they've seen: the marriage of Emperor Nero to his bride, the Lady Sabina. And through it all, the boy in the wedding dress stands perfectly still, his face serene, his posture flawless. He has learned his role well. He has practiced for months, years even. He knows that one wrong move, one slip of the mask, could mean his death. So he smiles and nods and speaks his vows in the carefully trained voice that sounds almost like a woman's. And everyone watches in horror, because they know that what they're witnessing isn't a wedding. It's something far darker. It's the ultimate expression of absolute power meeting absolute madness. It's what happens when an emperor's grief and obsession are allowed to reshape reality itself. It's the marriage of a god to a ghost, a ceremony celebrating a love that exists only in one man's fractured mind, a public declaration that one human being has been so completely erased, so thoroughly transformed, that nothing of his original self remains. The boy's name, before all this began, was probably just a slave name anyway, something functional, meaningless. The historical sources call him Sporus. It's likely not even his birth name, just the Greek word for seed or scattered, the kind of name you give to property, not a person. We'll never know what he was called before the empire took notice of him. That name is lost to history, just like the boy himself. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered, if you believe the truth about our past should not be buried, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will descend into the marble halls of Imperial Rome. We will trace the making of history's most grotesque obsession, from the golden emperor who seemed destined for greatness, to the woman whose beauty became her curse and his obsession, from the fatal night when rage turned to murder, to the teenage boy whose resemblance to a ghost sealed his fate, from the surgery that destroyed him, to the years of performance as a living doll, from the wedding that shocked Rome, to the public nightmare of Greece, to the year when 4 emperors claimed him like property, from the final degradation he refused to endure, to the choice that set him free. This is not just the story of one mad emperor. It is the story of absolute power unchecked, of grief transformed into monstrosity, of identity systematically erased, of a victim who endured longer than anyone thought possible, and who found, in the very end, a single moment of agency. This is the story of Sporus, the boy who became an empress, the human who became a doll, the ghost who refused to disappear. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus became Emperor of Rome at the age of 16. 16. An age when most boys are still figuring out who they are, still testing boundaries, still learning the difference between impulse and wisdom. But Nero wasn't most boys. He was the adopted son of Emperor Claudius, placed on the throne by his ruthlessly ambitious mother, Agrippina the Younger. The year was 54 AD, and Rome held its breath. Would this teenager be another Caligula, mad, cruel, drunk on power, or would he be something better? For the first 5 years, it seemed Rome had gotten lucky. The young emperor, guided by 2 steady hands, his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect, Sextus Afranius Burrus, proved surprisingly competent. Those early years, later called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero, saw reforms that benefited the common people. Taxes were reduced, Games and entertainment flourished. Public works projects employed thousands. Nero himself was unlike any emperor Rome had seen before. Where his predecessors had maintained stern dignity, presenting themselves as military commanders and political tacticians, Nero was an artist. He composed poetry. He sang. He played the lyre. He acted in theatrical productions. The aristocrats in the Senate were scandalized. Performing on stage was beneath the dignity of a nobleman, let alone an emperor. But the common people loved it. Here was an emperor who wasn't distant and cold, but vibrant and passionate, someone who shared their love of entertainment and spectacle. For a while, it worked, but there were cracks in the facade from the beginning. Small things, troubling things. In 55 AD, just a year into his reign, Nero's stepbrother, Britannicus, died suddenly at a banquet. Officially, it was illness, a seizure, the court physician said. But everyone knew the truth. Britannicus was the biological son of the previous emperor, Claudius. He had a stronger claim to the throne than Nero, and now, conveniently, he was dead. Poison, almost certainly poison, ordered by Nero or perhaps by his mother Agrippina, who would do anything to secure her son's position. It was the first murder, but it wouldn't be the last. The cracks grew wider. In 59 AD, Nero committed an act so shocking that it sent ripples of horror through even the jaded Roman court. He murdered his own mother. Agrippina had become a problem. The woman who had orchestrated Nero's rise to power now expected to rule through him, to be the true power behind the throne. She had manipulated, schemed, and possibly murdered to get her son crowned. Now she wanted her reward. But Nero, tasting the full sweetness of absolute authority, refused to be controlled. The relationship between mother and son deteriorated into open warfare, political, personal, vicious. Nero tried to drown her in a specially designed collapsing boat. When that failed, Agrippina swam to shore. He simply sent soldiers to finish the job. They beat her to death in her villa, stabbing her repeatedly while she screamed. When it was done, Nero looked at her body and reportedly said, "I didn't know I had such a beautiful mother." Matricide. The murder of one's own mother. In Roman culture, this was perhaps the most heinous crime imaginable, an offense against the gods themselves. But Nero was emperor. Who could punish him? Who would dare? After Agrippina's death, the careful guidance of Seneca and Burrus began to fail. Seneca tried to maintain his influence, to whisper wisdom and moderation into the young emperor's ear. But Nero was listening to different voices now. Voices that told him he was a god. Voices that encouraged his worst impulses rather than tempering them. His performances became mandatory. Senators and nobles were required to attend his concerts, forbidden from leaving even to attend to urgent business. Men faked illness or arranged mock funerals to escape the torture of sitting through Nero's hours-long recitals. The Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD, a widespread plot to assassinate Nero and replace him with the senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, gave the emperor the excuse he needed to purge anyone he distrusted. Seneca, his old tutor, was forced to commit suicide. The poet Lucan killed. Dozens of senators and knights executed or exiled. Nero was becoming paranoid, isolated, unpredictable. The golden boy was tarnishing, and then he met her. She was the most beautiful woman in Rome. That's what everyone said, and for once, the gossip might have been true. Poppaea Sabina was more than just beautiful. She was magnetic, intelligent, ambitious, calculating. She came from a distinguished family and had already been married twice. Her reputation was scandalous even by Roman standards. She was a woman who knew what she wanted and had no qualms about using her considerable assets, beauty, charm, and a razor-sharp political mind to get it. When Nero first saw her, probably at some court function or aristocratic gathering, something in his brain short-circuited. This wasn't a casual attraction. This wasn't a typical Roman affair, the kind that powerful men had all the time, discreetly, with courtesans, or slaves, or bored noblewomen. This was something else, something consuming, something that later historians would struggle to explain. Nero became obsessed with Poppaea Sabina. There was a problem, of course. Actually, several problems. Nero was already married to Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor, Claudius. Octavia was virtuous, dignified, and universally beloved by the Roman people. She represented tradition, stability, the old Julio-Claudian dynasty, and Nero didn't love her. He never had. The marriage had been purely political, arranged when he was adopted into the imperial family. Octavia was everything a Roman empress should be: modest, dutiful, reserved. Poppaea was none of those things. Where Octavia faded into the background, Poppaea commanded attention. Where Octavia accepted her role without complaint, Poppaea demanded what she wanted. Where Octavia was content to be the emperor's wife in name only, Poppaea wanted to be empress in truth. And Nero wanted her, needed her, could think of nothing else. The affair began scandalously. Whispers flew through Rome, the emperor and Poppaea barely bothering to hide their relationship, meeting openly, laughing together at public events while Octavia sat in dutiful silence. Nero showered Poppaea with gifts, jewels, properties, slaves. Whatever she wanted, she received. He built her a villa. He commissioned portraits and sculptures. He wrote poetry about her. Bad poetry probably, but poetry nonetheless. But gifts weren't enough. Poppaea wanted more. She wanted to be empress. So Nero, drunk on obsession and convinced of his own divine right to do whatever he pleased, made it happen. He divorced Octavia on trumped-up charges of adultery, charges so obviously false that even the usually compliant Senate balked. But Nero didn't care about their objections. He exiled Octavia to a remote island. And then, when her presence continued to be a rallying point for those who opposed his marriage to Poppaea, he had her killed. Octavia's veins were opened, and when she lingered too long, she was suffocated in a hot bath. Her head was cut off and sent to Poppaea as a gift. That's the kind of love Nero had, the kind that required human sacrifices. In 62 AD, Nero and Poppaea were married in a lavish ceremony. She became empress. She had everything she'd wanted. And for a brief time, she seemed to have the emperor completely under her control. She bore him a daughter in January of 63 AD, Claudia Augusta. The baby was immediately deified, declared a goddess, and given the title Augusta. Temples were built in her honor, sacrifices offered. The empire finally had an heir, but 4 months later, the baby died. Probably from some common infant illness, something that was untreatable in the ancient world. Nero's grief was profound. The baby was buried with full imperial honors. Her cult continued even after death. And then Poppaea became pregnant again. This second pregnancy carried enormous weight. An heir was desperately needed. Rome needed stability, continuity, and Nero needed to prove that his controversial marriage to Poppaea had been worth the scandal. worth the murder of his previous wife. Everything was riding on this pregnancy. Everything. The date was sometime in 65 AD. The exact day is lost to history, but what happened that night would change everything. Poppaea was several months pregnant, carrying what might be a son, a legitimate heir to the throne. She should have been resting, being pampered and protected. Instead, she was arguing with her husband. The ancient sources disagree on what sparked the fight. Suetonius says Nero came home late from the chariot races, something he was increasingly obsessed with. Tacitus suggests it was about his theatrical performances. Poppaea had grown tired of his neglect, of being pushed aside for his artistic pursuits. Whatever the cause, the argument escalated. Picture the scene, the imperial bedchamber, late at night. Poppaea, heavily pregnant, confronting her husband about his behavior. Nero, probably drunk, exhausted from a day of indulgence, in no mood to be criticized. Words were exchanged, harsh words. The kind of things couples say when all the resentment that's been building for months suddenly comes pouring out. And then Nero lost control. The accounts vary in their details, but the outcome is always the same. Some sources say he kicked her, others that he struck her with his fists. Tacitus describes it as a single, devastating blow to her abdomen. Cassius Dio speaks of a sustained attack. However it happened, the result was catastrophic. Poppaea collapsed, bleeding, crying out in pain. Servants rushed in. Physicians were summoned immediately. The best medical minds in Rome appeared within minutes, called from their beds, running through the palace corridors. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternating between begging her forgiveness and ordering her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He offered the physicians fortunes if they could save her. He threatened them with torture and execution if they failed, but there was nothing they could do. Internal injuries, massive trauma. In an age before modern medicine, before surgery could repair torn organs, there was no hope. Poppaea Sabina died within hours. The unborn child died with her, and Nero's mind shattered. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Nero refused to leave Poppaea's body. He stayed with her corpse for hours, then days, talking to her, begging her to wake up, denying the reality of what he'd done. His advisors tried to convince him to allow her burial. Roman custom required prompt disposal of bodies, but Nero refused. He ordered her body to be embalmed, preserved. He wanted to keep her. Eventually, they convinced him that cremation was necessary, but even then, he insisted on modifications to the traditional funeral. Her body wasn't burned on a pyre like a normal Roman citizen. Instead, she was stuffed with spices and embalmed in the manner of Eastern kings before being placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. The funeral was outrageously expensive. Nero reportedly used more incense and spices in her cremation than Arabia produced in an entire year. It was excess as grief, waste as memorial. But throwing money at her funeral couldn't bring her back. Nero fell into a depression so profound that it alarmed even his most cynical courtiers. He wandered the palace at night, calling her name. He sat for hours staring at her portraits. He ordered that no one was to refer to her in the past tense. She was to be spoken of as if she still lived. The guilt was eating him alive. He had killed the one person he claimed to love more than anything. His rage, his lack of control, had destroyed her and their unborn child. And unlike his other victims, his mother, his stepbrother, his first wife, Poppaea's death brought him no political advantage. It was purely, horrifically, waste. His advisors watched nervously as the emperor descended deeper into madness. He made bizarre pronouncements. He claimed to see Poppaea's ghost. He insisted that the gods were punishing him, and simultaneously that the gods had taken her to Olympus to become a goddess herself. He searched for her everywhere, in every hallway, every garden, every room of the vast imperial palace, looking for her face in crowds, hoping to catch a glimpse of her walking through the columns of the palace as she had when she was alive. And then, about 3 months after her death, he found her, or rather, he found someone who looked like her. A young freedman, perhaps 15 years old, was walking through one of the palace corridors, probably running some errand or delivering a message. A routine task, the kind of thing freedmen in the imperial household did a dozen times a day. He passed by the doorway to Nero's private chambers. The emperor looked up and froze, because the boy had Poppaea's face. Not exactly, of course. He was younger, male. His features were his own, but something about the eyes, their shape, their color, something about the delicate bone structure, the way the light caught his profile. It was close enough. For a mind desperately searching for any connection to the woman he'd lost, it was more than close enough. It was a sign, a message from the gods. Poppaea, reborn, sent back to him. Nero called out, his voice hoarse from months of grief and rage. "You, stop, turn around, come here." The boy, his name was probably Sporus, though that was likely a slave name, not his birth name, obeyed immediately. When the emperor spoke, you obeyed. There was no choice. He approached. He bowed. He waited to hear what service the emperor required, and Nero stared at him. For a long time, silent, his eyes moving over the boy's face, feature by feature, searching. "What is your name?" Nero finally asked. The boy told him, something Greek, probably. A slave name, functional, meaningless. "You will come with me," Nero said. Not a request, a command. The boy followed the emperor through the palace, confused but obedient. He was brought to private chambers, surrounded by guards, and then Nero dismissed everyone else. They were alone. "You look like her," Nero said, his voice strange, distant. "Do you know that? You have her eyes, her face." The boy had no idea who her was. He was just a freedman. He didn't know the details of imperial romances and tragedies. He probably stammered something respectful, confused. Nero circled him slowly, studying him from every angle. "It's perfect," the emperor murmured. "It's a gift. The gods have sent you to me, to replace what I lost." And then Nero said something that would haunt the boy for the rest of his short life. "I'm going to make you into her, into my Poppaea. We'll fix everything that's wrong. We'll make you beautiful, perfect, exactly like her." The boy probably didn't understand at first. Make him into her? What did that mean? "You'll need surgery, of course," Nero continued, speaking more to himself than to the frightened teenager in front of him. "To make you more feminine, more like her. And training, lots of training. how to walk like she did, talk like she did, move like she did. The boy's blood must have run cold as understanding began to dawn. "You're going to be my wife," Nero said, smiling for the first time in months. "My Empress, Poppaea, return to me. Isn't it wonderful?" The boy started to speak, to object, to beg, to explain that he was a person, that he had his own life. But Nero cut him off with a gesture. "The physicians will be summoned tomorrow," the Empress said. "They'll explain the procedure. It won't take long, a few hours probably. And then, after you've recovered, we'll begin the real work." Guards appeared. The boy was taken to a private suite of rooms, locked in, guarded. That night, alone in luxurious quarters that felt like a prison, the boy named Sporus understood his fate. He was going to be erased, remade, transformed into a dead woman to satisfy an emperor's grief-driven madness. And there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The most powerful man in the world had decided, and when Nero decided, reality itself bent to his will. Within a week, the palace physicians had prepared their instruments, and Sporus, held down by guards as he screamed and struggled, was dragged into a private chamber for surgery that would destroy him forever. Let's be clear about who Sporus was before Nero's attention fell on him like a curse. He was young, probably 14 or 15, when this nightmare began. He was a freedman in the imperial household, which sounds privileged, and in some ways, it was. Freedmen weren't slaves, not technically. They had been granted their freedom by the emperor, usually as a reward for good service or because they'd been born in the imperial household and freed as children as a gesture of generosity. Being a freedman in the imperial court came with certain advantages. You received an education, you learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek. You were trained in administrative tasks, accounting, correspondence. Freedmen often rose to positions of significant power in the imperial bureaucracy, managing estates, handling finances, serving as secretaries to the most powerful people in Rome. But here's the thing, that freedom was conditional, precarious, built on sand. Freedmen owed everything to their former masters. Everything. Their freedom, their position, their entire existence was a gift that could be revoked at any moment. They had no independent power, no family connections to fall back on, no legal protections if their patron decided to withdraw favor. They were free, but only as long as they pleased the emperor. And the name Sporus, if that was even his real name, tells you something about his status. It's Greek, meaning something like seed, or scattered, or sown. It's the kind of name you give to property, functional, descriptive, not a name chosen with love or care, but a label assigned to an object. We don't know what his birth name was. We don't even know if he had one. The historical sources only call him Sporus, and that was probably a slave name given to him in childhood. His real name, the name his mother called him, if he even knew his mother, is lost to history, just like he would soon be lost. Before Nero noticed him, Sporus's life was probably relatively normal for a freedman. He had duties. He ran errands through the vast complex of the imperial palace. He carried messages, delivered documents, assisted with whatever tasks needed young, educated hands. He probably had friends among the other freedmen and slaves, maybe even hopes for the future. Perhaps he dreamed of rising through the imperial bureaucracy, of someday managing an estate or serving as a secretary to someone important. He had a life. It was small, circumscribed by his station, but it was his. And then, one day, He walked past the wrong doorway at the wrong time. The Emperor looked up and saw a ghost. Picture the scene. Sporus is walking through one of the palace's endless corridors. It's mid-morning maybe. The sun slants through the high windows, illuminating the marble floors and painted frescoes. He's carrying something, a wax tablet with a message perhaps, or a scroll that needs to be delivered to someone in the administrative wing. He's thinking about the mundane things you think about when you're running errands. Whether he'll have time to eat before his next task. Whether the message he's carrying is urgent enough that he should hurry. He passes by the doorway to the Emperor's private chambers. He probably does this every day. It's just another corridor, just another room. The Emperor has dozens of suites throughout the palace complex. But today, the door is open, and Nero is inside. And Nero, for some reason, happens to look up at exactly the moment Sporus walks past. Their eyes meet, just for a second, and Nero's entire body goes rigid. "You!" the Emperor calls out, his voice sharp enough to stop Sporus in his tracks. "Stop! Don't move!" Sporus freezes, every instinct screaming that something is wrong. When the Emperor gives you a direct command, you obey instantly. But there's an edge to Nero's voice that makes the boy's stomach clench with fear. "Turn around," Nero orders. "Slowly. Look at me." Sporus turns. He's trying to keep his face neutral, respectful. He has no idea what he's done wrong. Has he forgotten some task? Failed to deliver a message? Is he about to be punished for some mistake he doesn't even know he made? Nero rises from his chair and walks toward him. The Emperor moves like a man in a trance, his eyes locked on Sporus's face with an intensity that's absolutely terrifying. He gets close. Too close. Close enough that Sporus can smell the wine on his breath, see the sleepless shadows under his eyes. Nero reaches out and touches Sporus's face. His fingers trace the line of the boy's cheek, his jaw, his temple. The touch is gentle, almost reverent, but it makes Sporus's skin crawl with instinctive horror. "Poppaea," Nero whispers. "You came back." Sporus has no idea who Poppaea is. He's just a freedman. He doesn't follow imperial gossip. He certainly doesn't know about the Empress's death or the Emperor's descent into madness. "Your Majesty, he starts to say, but Nero cuts him off. "The eyes," Nero breathes, his face transforming with something like joy. "It's the eyes. Exactly the same. And the bone structure, the way your face catches the light. It's perfect. It's her. You're her." Sporus tries to step back, but Nero's hand clamps down on his shoulder, holding him in place. "The gods sent you to me," Nero continues, his voice rising with manic energy. "Don't you see? I prayed for her return. I begged, and they answered. They sent you, a perfect vessel. We just need to make a few adjustments, nothing major, just enough to—" "Your Majesty, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Sporus tries again, but Nero isn't listening. He's circling Sporus now, examining him from every angle, his face alight with a terrible excitement. "We'll need the best physicians," Nero mutters. "The best teachers. Clothes, jewelry, everything must be perfect. Everything must be exactly as it was." Guards appear in the doorway. Nero snaps his fingers, and they step forward. "Take him to the East Wing," Nero commands. "Private quarters, no visitors. He's not to leave." The guards grab Sporus's arms. He tries to pull away, panic finally overriding training. "Wait, Please, I don't understand." "You will," Nero says, and now he's smiling, actually smiling. "You'll understand everything. We're going to make you beautiful. We're going to make you perfect. We're going to make you into my Empress." The guards drag Sporus away. He's babbling now, trying to explain that he's just a freedman, that there's been a mistake, that he's nobody, nothing, not whoever the Emperor thinks he is. But his protests echo off the marble walls and disappear into silence. In his chambers, Nero is already calling for scribes, making lists, summoning physicians, planning every detail of the transformation that's about to begin. He's been given a gift, a second chance. Poppaea returned to him. All he has to do is fix the small imperfections, make the vessel match the memory. It never occurs to him that the vessel is a human being, a boy with his own life, his own identity, his own hopes and fears. That boy is about to be erased. The quarters they take Sporus to are beautiful. Of course they are. This is the imperial palace. Even the prisons are luxurious. There's a bedroom with a massive bed draped in silk. A sitting room with couches and tables inlaid with ivory. Windows overlooking the palace gardens. Servants appear with food, wine, anything he might need. But the doors are locked, and guards stand outside. Sporus spends that first night in a state of shock, his mind trying to process what just happened. The Emperor touched his face, called him by a woman's name, talked about making adjustments. What did that mean? What adjustments? He tries to piece together what he knows. There was an empress. She died. The Emperor went mad with grief. And now Nero thinks Sporus looks like her? It's insane. Sporus has seen his own reflection. He's just a boy, a freedman with a common face. There's nothing special about him, nothing that should have attracted the attention of an emperor. But it doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what Nero believes. And Nero believes he's found Poppaea reborn. The next morning, they come for him. Not guards this time, but physicians. 3 of them, middle-aged men with the confident bearing of people who are very good at their jobs. They're accompanied by a court official who carries a scroll. "Please sit," one of the physicians says, his voice professionally neutral. Sporus sits. He has no choice. The official unrolls the scroll and begins to read. It's a formal decree, written in the bureaucratic language of imperial commands. But the meaning is clear enough. The Emperor has decided that Sporus shall undergo certain procedures to make his appearance more feminine. These procedures are to be carried out by the palace physicians, using the best techniques available. Upon completion and recovery, Sporus shall be trained in the manners and behaviors appropriate to a woman of the imperial court. He shall then be known by the name Sabina, and shall fulfill the role of Empress. The official rolls up the scroll. Do you understand? Sporus understands perfectly. They're going to castrate him, mutilate him, transform him into something he's not. I don't want this, he manages to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The physicians exchange glances. One of them, the oldest, speaks gently. The Emperor has decided. We have our orders. But I'm a person, Sporus says, and he hates how his voice cracks. I'm not whoever he thinks I am. Please, can't you explain to him? Tell him he's made a mistake? The old physician's expression softens slightly. There is no mistake in the Emperor's eyes, and we cannot refuse an imperial command. Please, Sporus begs, And he doesn't care that he's crying now. Please don't do this. But he can see it in their faces. They're not cruel men. They probably feel sorry for him. But pity won't save him. Nothing will save him. The procedure will take place tomorrow morning, the official says. We'll give you something for the pain. The recovery will take several weeks. You'll be well cared for. They leave him alone with that knowledge. Tomorrow morning, they're going to take away part of his body, part of his identity, part of his very self. And there's nothing he can do to stop it. He's just a freedman with a slave name. He has no family to appeal to, no patron except the emperor himself, no legal rights that could protect him. He's completely, utterly powerless. That night, Sporus doesn't sleep. He spends the hours pacing his beautiful prison, thinking desperately of escape. But the guards are outside, the windows are too high, and even if he could get out of this room, where would he go? The moment he left the palace, he'd be a runaway freedman, subject to immediate recapture and punishment. There's no escape. The emperor has decided his fate. At dawn, they come for him. The physicians, the official, the guards, just in case he tries to resist. It's time, they say. And Sporus, his face pale and his hands shaking, allows himself to be led to the chamber where his life will end and something else's will begin. The guards hold him down. The physicians prepare their instruments. Someone forces wine laced with opium down his throat. The ancient world's best attempt at anesthesia, which is to say, almost nothing. The last thing Sporus sees before the drugs take partial effect is the gleam of a bronze blade. The last thing he feels is pain that makes the world go white. And the last thing he knows, as consciousness begins to slip away, is that the boy he was is dying on this table. What survives the surgery will be something else. Someone else. A ghost named Sabina. Content warning: this section contains clinical description of surgical mutilation. While historically accurate, it is disturbing. Roman medicine in the 1st century AD was more advanced than we sometimes give it credit for. Roman physicians could set bones, perform cataract surgery, remove bladder stones. They understood basic anatomy, had developed sophisticated surgical tools, and had even discovered the benefits of boiling instruments to prevent infection. But surgery was still brutal, primitive, agonizing. There was no real anesthesia. Opium, if you were lucky, would dull the pain to something barely endurable. Wine could make you drunk enough not to care quite so much about what was happening to you. Mandrake root, in high doses, might make you unconscious, or might kill you. For most surgical patients, the only real pain management was speed. The faster the surgeon could work, the less time you spent in agony, and the faster you could reach the mercy of unconsciousness from shock. The surgery they performed on Sporus was castration. This wasn't a medical treatment for a disease. It wasn't being done to save his life. It was being done to make him look more feminine, to strip away the most obvious physical markers of his biological sex. It was mutilation dressed up as medicine. The historical sources don't give us detailed descriptions of what exactly was done to Sporus, but we know what Roman castration typically involved. The testicles were removed, obviously, but depending on the desired outcome, other alterations might be made as well. Sometimes the entire scrotum was removed. Sometimes a surgeon would attempt more extensive modifications to create a more feminine appearance between the legs. These were not precise procedures. There was no understanding of hormones, no knowledge of the complex biological systems that regulate sexual development. The physicians were working from crude anatomical knowledge and a vague understanding that removing certain body parts made men look and sound different. What we do know is this: it took hours. Sporus would have been held down on a surgical table by guards while the physicians worked. The opium in his system would have dulled the pain, but not eliminated it. He would have been conscious for at least part of the procedure, unable to move, unable to scream properly, feeling every cut. The risk of death was enormous. Infection was the biggest killer. Surgery was performed with bronze or iron instruments that were cleaned but not sterilized in the modern sense. Shock and blood loss could kill you before the procedure was even finished. And even if you survived the surgery itself, the recovery period was a minefield of potential complications. But Sporus survived. Somehow, he survived. The physicians were good at their jobs, and they had every incentive to keep him alive. Failing the Emperor's direct command would have meant their own deaths, so they cut carefully. They controlled the bleeding. They sutured what needed to be closed and bandaged what needed to heal. And when it was over, they carried his unconscious body to a recovery room and waited to see if he would live or die. For weeks, Sporus lay in a drugged haze, drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain was extraordinary, the kind of pain that makes you want to die just to make it stop. Servants tended to him around the clock. They changed his bandages, administered more opium when the pain got too intense, helped him with the humiliating intimate functions that he could no longer manage alone. He developed a fever on the third day. For 48 hours, he burned with infection, delirious and shaking. The physicians worked frantically, applying poultices, administering herbal remedies, praying to Asclepius, the god of medicine. He nearly died, but he didn't. Slowly, painfully, his body began to heal. The wounds closed, the fever broke. He was able to sit up, then stand, then walk short distances around the room. But the person who emerged from that recovery was not the person who had been carried into it. Physically, Sporus was permanently altered. His voice, already high-pitched from youth, would never deepen properly now. His body would remain smooth, hairless, developing none of the masculine characteristics he would have gained through normal puberty. He was frozen in a strange in-between state, not quite male, not quite female, something other. But the physical changes, horrific as they were, weren't the worst of it. The worst was psychological. Sporus had been violated in the most fundamental way possible. His body had been taken from him, mutilated without his consent, altered permanently to serve someone else's fantasy. Every time he looked down at himself, he was reminded of what had been done to him, what had been stolen. And it wasn't over. The surgery was just the beginning. As soon as the physicians declared him recovered enough to begin training, the real work of erasing Sporus began. They started with the name, no longer Sporus, that slave name, that Greek word meaning scattered or seed. Now he was Sabina, named after the dead empress, Poppaea Sabina. Everyone in his service was instructed to use the new name exclusively. When they spoke to him, when they referred to him, even when they thought about him, he was Sabina now, had always been Sabina. The name Sporus was to be forgotten. It was a small thing maybe, just a name, but names matter. Names are how we define ourselves, how we exist in the world. Taking away someone's name is the first step in taking away their identity. And they didn't stop there. The wardrobe came next. Servants appeared with armfuls of clothing, silk gowns, delicate tunics, stolas draped in the Roman style. These weren't new garments made for him. Many of them were Poppaea's actual clothes, taken from storage, altered slightly to fit his smaller frame. He was expected to wear them every day, all day. The feel of silk against his skin, the weight of fabric designed for a woman's body, the constant reminder that he was being dressed like a doll. The jewelry was worse. Emeralds, sapphires, pearls, heavy gold necklaces that had hung around Poppaea's throat, rings that had graced her fingers, earrings. His ears had to be pierced for those, another small violation, that dangled and caught the light. Every piece had belonged to her. Every piece was meant to transform him into her ghost. And then came the lessons. A team of specialists was assembled. Makeup artists, hairdressers, voice coaches, dance instructors, etiquette tutors. Each one tasked with teaching teaching Sabina, how to be a woman, or rather, how to pretend to be one. The makeup lessons were humiliating. Sporus had to sit for hours while artists taught him how to apply kohl around his eyes, making them appear larger, more feminine, how to use white lead powder to lighten his skin, how to apply rouge to his cheeks, how to stain his lips red with wine lees. Like this, they would say, demonstrating on his face. See? It makes your features softer, more delicate, more like hers, always like hers. Everything was measured against the memory of Poppaea. The hairdressing was even worse. Roman women wore their hair in elaborate styles, piled high on their heads, woven with ribbons and ornaments. It took hours to create these styles, and Sporus, Sabina, had to learn not just to wear them, but to help maintain them, to understand which style was appropriate for which occasion. His hair was grown out, curled with heated irons, dyed, pinned into place with golden clasps. Sometimes flowers were woven into it, sometimes strings of pearls. Every morning, he woke up and spent 2 hours being transformed. Every night, it all came off, and he could see his real face in the mirror for just a few moments before sleep. And then the next morning, the mask went back on. But the voice training, that was the hardest. Roman women spoke differently than men. Higher pitch, obviously, but also different intonation patterns, different word choices, different ways of expressing emotion. The castration had prevented his voice from deepening, but it hadn't made him sound like a woman. He had to learn that, had to practice, hours every day, listening to recordings of female voices, watching female slaves and courtesans and trying to imitate them, trying to match their patterns. Too low, his coach would say. Again, higher, softer, let the sound come from here, touching his throat, not from here, touching his chest. I know it's difficult, the coach said once, with what might have been genuine sympathy. You're fighting against your body's natural inclinations. But the emperor expects perfection. The emperor. Always the emperor. Everything came back to Nero's expectations, Nero's desires, Nero's mad vision of resurrection. But the voice training was difficult, not just because it was hard to do. It was difficult because it struck at something fundamental. Your voice is yours. It comes from inside you. Learning to make it sound like someone else's voice is learning to erase yourself from the inside out. And then there was deportment. How to walk, how to sit, how to stand, how to hold your hands, how to gesture. All the tiny physical behaviors that collectively read as feminine in Roman culture. Smaller steps, the instructor would say. glide, don't stride. Keep your elbows close to your body. When you sit, cross your ankles, not your legs. Keep your chin down slightly. It makes your face look softer. Never look directly at a man unless he's speaking to you. Lower your gaze. Hundreds of tiny rules. Thousands of micro corrections. Every natural movement Sporus had ever made was wrong, masculine, inappropriate. He had to unlearn 15 years of moving through the world as a boy and relearn it all as a woman. The training went on for months. Relentless, exhausting, soul-crushing, and through it all, Nero would visit. Once a week, sometimes more often, the emperor would come to Sporus's quarters to check on his progress. These visits were the worst part, because Nero didn't see Sporus. He saw Poppaea. "My love," he would say, entering the room with a smile, "you look more beautiful every time I see you." Sporus Sabina had learned by now not to contradict him. "Thank you, my lord," he would say in his carefully trained voice. Nero would sit and they would have conversations, but they weren't real conversations. They were performances. "Do you remember," Nero would say, "that night we went to the theatre? When that actor forgot his lines and we laughed so hard?" Sporus had never been to the theatre with Nero. That memory belonged to Poppaea, to a life he had never lived, but he had learned to play along. "Of course I remember," he would say. "It was wonderful." "Tell me what you remember about it," Nero would prompt, his eyes eager, and Sporus would have to improvise, to create false memories on the spot, to pretend he had been there, that he had shared that experience. He'd gotten good at reading Nero's face, at figuring out which details to emphasize, which emotions to express. "You were wearing your purple cloak," he might say, "and you held my hand during the performance." "Yes!" Nero would exclaim, delighted. "Yes, exactly!" You remember, these sessions were exhausting. Sporus had to constantly maintain the fiction, never slipping, never acknowledging the reality of who he actually was. One wrong word, one break in the character, and Nero's mood could turn dangerous. But as the months passed, something strange happened. Sporus got better at it. So much better that he started to lose track of where the performance ended and his real self began. When you spend every waking moment pretending to be someone else, when everyone around you treats you as that other person, when you've been physically altered to resemble them, who are you really? The boy named Sporus, if that had ever really been his name, was fading, like a ghost himself, becoming more and more transparent, less and less real. And in his place, Sabina was taking form, the empress who had never existed, the woman who was a man, who was a boy, who had been nobody. In the spring of 67 AD, nearly 2 years after Poppaea's death and 18 months after Sporus's capture and transformation, Nero made an announcement that shocked even the jaded Roman court. He was going to marry Sabina, a full, formal, legal wedding, with all the traditional Roman ceremonies, with witnesses and legal documents and religious blessings. He was going to marry his dead wife's ghost, worn like a costume by a mutilated teenager. The preparations began immediately. The wedding would be the most lavish ceremony Rome had seen in years. Nero threw money at it with the same reckless abandon he'd shown at Poppaea's funeral. The finest silks, imported flowers, musicians hired from across the empire, chefs preparing exotic delicacies. And at the center of it all, Sabina, Sporus, because inside, In the parts of himself he kept hidden, he was still Sporus. Watched the preparations with growing dread. This was the final step, the complete erasure. Once he was legally married to Nero, once those documents were signed and witnessed, the transformation would be complete. He would be the Empress, not pretending, not play-acting. Actually, legally, officially the Empress of Rome. A bride's gown was created. Poppaea's old wedding dress was taken out of storage and modified to fit. The veil she had worn, the flowers she had carried. As the wedding day approached, Sporus spent more and more time staring at his reflection in the polished bronze mirrors, trying to see himself underneath the makeup, the hair, the costume, but he couldn't find himself anymore. The boy was gone. Only the ghost remained. On the morning of the wedding, servants dressed him in the bridal gown. Layer after layer of silk, dyed the traditional saffron yellow. Poppaea's jewelry was clasped around his neck, hung from his ears, slipped onto his fingers. They painted his face one final time, applied the makeup with expert precision, arranged his hair in the 6 traditional braids of a Roman bride. And then they gave him a mirror. The person looking back at him was beautiful, ethereal, perfect, and completely unrecognizable. "You're ready," the servant said. "The emperor is waiting." They led him through the palace to the great ceremonial hall. He could hear music playing, smell the incense burning, see the torchlight flickering through the doorways. At the threshold, he stopped. For just a moment, this was it, the point of no return. Once he walked through that doorway, once he stood beside Nero and spoke those vows, the last fragment of his old self would be obliterated. He could refuse. He could run. He could tell them all that this was madness, that he was not Poppaea, that he was just a boy who had been tortured and mutilated and dressed up like a doll. But what would that accomplish? Nero would have him killed, or dragged back and forced to do it anyway. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. So Sporus took a breath, put on his trained smile, and stepped forward into the torchlight. The crowd gasped when they saw him. Some in genuine admiration. The transformation really was remarkable. Others in horror at what they were witnessing. But no one objected. No one spoke up. They just watched in silence as the beautiful bride glided down the aisle toward the waiting emperor. Nero's face, when he saw Sabina, was radiant, pure joy. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, his beloved wife, returned from death, coming back to him. They reached the platform, stood side by side. The priests began the ceremony. Traditional vows were spoken, prayers offered, legal documents signed and witnessed. Through it all, Sporus, Sabina, played his part perfectly. He had practiced for this, rehearsed every word, every gesture, every smile. And when the priest pronounced them married, when Nero took his face in his hands and kissed him gently, tenderly, with a love that was absolutely real and absolutely insane, the ghost married the madman, and the boy named Sporus disappeared completely into history. Sporus woke up in the imperial bedchamber, the room where emperors had slept for generations, where Poppaea had once slept. The bed was enormous, draped in purple silk. Golden statues stood in the corners, gods and heroes watching with blank eyes. Through the windows, he could see the palace gardens stretching toward the city beyond. Nero was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, watching him with that expression Sporus had come to know too well. Adoration mixed with possession, love mixed with madness. "Good morning, my love," Nero said softly. "Good morning," Sporus replied automatically, in the voice that was no longer quite his own. This was his life now, not a nightmare he would wake up from, not a temporary ordeal to be endured. This was permanent, legal, official. He was the Empress of Rome. Within hours, the full weight of that reality came crashing down. Servants appeared, his servants now, assigned specifically to him. A steward presented himself, explaining that he would manage the Empress's household. A secretary brought documents requiring the Empress's seal. Guards stationed themselves outside the door. For his protection, they said, though Sporus knew they were also there to watch him, to ensure he didn't run. An entire apparatus of imperial power had been activated, all centered on maintaining the fiction that he was Poppaea Sabina, returned and remarried to Nero. "You'll need to make appearances," the steward explained. "State dinners, public ceremonies. The emperor wishes you to be seen at his side as much as possible." Of course he did. The whole point of this grotesque charade was to prove to the world, and to himself, that Nero had successfully brought his dead wife back. That first public appearance came that very evening. A state dinner with the Senate's leading members, foreign dignitaries, military commanders. The most powerful people in Rome gathered to celebrate the emperor's new marriage. Sporus was dressed in yet another of Poppaea's gowns, this one green silk embroidered with golden thread. The servants spent 2 hours on his hair, his makeup, his jewelry. By the time they were finished, he looked like a goddess carved from marble. "Perfect," Nero said when he saw him. "Absolutely perfect, just like I remember." They walked into the dining hall together, Nero's hand possessively on Sporus's lower back. The assembled guests rose and bowed. Their faces were masks of polite congratulation, but Sporus could see the truth underneath, the confusion, the revulsion, the morbid curiosity. They knew. Of course they knew. Everyone in Rome knew what Sporus was, what had been done to him. But they played along because to do otherwise was to challenge the emperor's sanity. And challenging Nero's sanity was suicide. Dinner was a 7-hour ordeal, course after course of exotic foods, wine flowing like water, musicians playing in the background, and Sporus sitting at Nero's right hand, playing the role of devoted empress. Men would come to pay their respects, bowing to him as if he were actually a woman, actually the person Nero believed him to be. "Empress Sabina, you look radiant. My lady, it's an honor. How wonderful to have you back with us." Back with us. As if he had been Poppaea, as if he had died and returned, as if the entire horrifying reality of what had happened could be politely ignored. Sporus smiled, nodded graciously, spoke in his carefully trained voice. "Thank you, Senator. How kind of you to say. Yes, it's wonderful to be here. The Emperor has been so generous. Every word a lie, every smile a mask, every moment a performance." And Nero, beside him, was glowing, genuinely happy, convinced that his plan had worked, that he had defeated death itself through sheer force of will. That night set the pattern for what would become Sporus's new normal. Days filled with appearances, ceremonies, performances. Always at Nero's side, always perfectly dressed, perfectly made up, perfectly behaved. The ghost who never stopped haunting. The imperial household assigned to Empress Sabina was enormous. 50 servants, personal guards, a secretary, a treasurer, multiple hairdressers and makeup artists, a food taster, a physician. Sporus had his own quarters, a suite of rooms in the palace decorated to Nero's specifications, which meant decorated exactly as Poppaea's rooms had been. The same furniture, the same wall paintings, even the same arrangement of cushions on the couches. Walking into those rooms was like stepping into a dead woman's tomb. He had his own income too, a vast sum drawn from the imperial treasury, meant to cover his household expenses and personal needs. On paper, he was one of the wealthiest people in Rome, but he couldn't spend a single coin without it being noted, recorded, reported to Nero. Every decision was scrutinized, every choice monitored. The golden cage was still a cage. His days followed a rigid schedule. Wake at dawn, 2 hours with the servants for grooming and dressing, breakfast with Nero, during which he had to be charming and attentive, morning audiences, where he sat beside the emperor and watched him conduct business, lunch, afternoon appearances, perhaps a visit to the theatre or the baths or a temple dedication, more grooming for the evening, dinner, often with guests, finally, the private evening with Nero. That last part, the private evenings, were the most exhausting, because that's when Nero wanted to talk, to reminisce, to share memories of their life together. "Remember when we went to Baiae?" Nero would say. "That little villa by the sea? We spent a whole week there, just the two of us." Sporus had never been to Baiae, but by now he'd been told about that trip so many times that he could describe it as if he'd actually been there. "The sunset was beautiful," he would say. "We watched it from the terrace every evening." "Yes," Nero would exclaim, "and the wine. That local vintage you loved so much. We should go back there sometime. Would you like that?" "Very much, my lord." These conversations were a minefield. Sporus had to remember which memories Nero had shared, which details were important, which emotions were expected. He'd become skilled at reading Nero's moods, at giving him exactly the responses he wanted. But it was draining, soul-destroying. Every conversation was another brick in the wall separating Sporus from his own identity. Sometimes, late at night, when Nero was finally asleep, Sporus would lie awake and try to remember who he had been before all this. What had he liked? What had he wanted from life? What had his voice sounded like before they trained it higher? He couldn't remember. It had only been 2 years, but that boy felt like a stranger. Like someone who had died and been replaced by this hollow thing that wore jewelry and smiled on command. But the private performances were nothing compared to the public ones. Nero insisted on taking his empress everywhere. Every public event, every ceremony, every appearance before the crowds. He wanted the world to see what he'd accomplished, to witness his victory over death. The first time Sporus appeared in public as empress, the crowd's reaction was complicated. Some people cheered. They genuinely seemed to believe, or wanted to believe, that this was just the emperor remarrying, taking a new bride who happened to resemble his late wife. They chose to see what they wanted to see. Others were silent, staring, trying to process what they were witnessing. A boy, dressed as a woman, the emperor's hand on his waist, the impossible claim that this was Poppaea Sabina. And others whispered. Sporus couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see their mouths moving, see them leaning toward each other to share shocked observations. The gossip spread like wildfire through Rome. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to say about the emperor's new wife. The religious ceremonies were the worst. Nero insisted that Sabina accompany him to temples, to sacrifices, to festivals. They would stand together while priests offered prayers to the gods, asking for blessings on the imperial couple. Standing there, dressed in silks and jewelry, while priests blessed a marriage that was a mockery, while they prayed for fertility and children from a union that could never produce them. It was surreal, horrifying in its absurdity, but everyone played along, the priests, the crowd, the officials, because this was the emperor's will, and the emperor's will was law. Sporus learned to keep his face neutral during these events, to smile when appropriate, to bow his head during prayers, to play the part of the pious empress. Inside, he was screaming, but outside, he was perfect. The theater was even worse. Nero loved performing, and now he insisted that Sabina sit in the imperial box and watch. For hours, while Nero sang, played the lyre, or acted in dramatic productions. The audience couldn't leave. They were trapped, forced to watch and applaud. And Sporus was trapped too, forced to look enraptured, to clap enthusiastically, to be the devoted wife, admiring her talented husband. Sometimes, during these endless performances, Sporus would let his mind drift. He'd think about nothing, become as blank as the masks the actors wore. It was easier than being present for the reality of what his life had become. And then, in the spring of 67 AD, about 6 months after the wedding, Nero announced his plans for a grand tour of Greece. Greece was the cultural heart of the ancient world, the birthplace of philosophy, theatre, poetry, athletics. For Nero, who fancied himself the greatest artist and athlete in the empire, Greece was the ultimate stage. He planned to compete in all the major festivals, the Olympic Games, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games. He would show the Greeks, who had invented these competitions, that Rome had surpassed them, that Nero himself was the greatest performer in history, and of course, Sabina would accompany him. The journey took months. They traveled with an enormous entourage, hundreds of servants, guards, officials, hangers-on. A mobile court, processing across the landscape like a slow-moving army. Every city they passed through held celebrations in Nero's honor. Local officials bent over backwards to please the emperor. Temples opened their doors. Crowds gathered to see the legendary Nero and his beautiful bride. The Greek aristocrats were more sophisticated than their Roman counterparts. They'd seen everything in their long history, but even they seemed unsettled by Sabina. They would bow respectfully, make polite conversation, but Sporus could see the calculation in their eyes, trying to figure out what this person was, what it meant that the Emperor of Rome traveled with this creature, because that's what Sporus felt like by then. Not a person, a creature, something that had been made rather than born. The competitions themselves were farcical. Nero competed in everything, singing, lyre playing, poetry, chariot racing. And he won everything, every single event. Not because he was skilled, but because the judges knew that awarding victory to anyone else would be suicide. When Nero competed in the chariot race at the Olympic Games, he fell out of his chariot and couldn't finish. The judges still declared him the winner. Because, they reasoned, he would have won if he'd been able to finish. Nero accepted his victories with genuine pride. apparently believing he'd earned them through talent rather than terror. He collected 1,800 crowns during the Greek tour, 1,800 victories. He wore them proudly, had them carried in procession, proclaimed himself the greatest competitor in history. And through it all, Sabina sat in the place of honor, watching and applauding. Greek philosophers and poets would sometimes approach, wanting to meet the famous empress. They'd speak to Sporus in Greek, asking about her thoughts on various subjects, trying to have actual conversations. Sporus had to be careful. The real Poppaea had been intelligent, educated, witty. He had to channel her personality while never forgetting his place, never saying anything that might displease Nero. "What do you think about the Stoic doctrine of apatheia, my lady?" a philosopher asked once. Sporus, who had learned philosophy as part of his freedman education, could have given a genuine answer, but Sabina wouldn't engage too deeply. Sabina would deflect charmingly. "I think," he said, "that philosophy is a marvelous thing for philosophers, but I prefer to leave such weighty matters to experts like yourself." The philosopher smiled, satisfied. The woman was beautiful and knew her place. Perfect. But inside, Sporus wanted to scream. He wanted to discuss philosophy. He wanted to argue, to think, to be treated like a person with a mind. But that wasn't his role. His role was to be decorative, beautiful, silent when necessary, present but not truly there. The Greece tour lasted nearly a year, an entire year of constant performance, constant vigilance, constant erasure. When they finally prepared to return to Rome, Sporus felt nothing. Not relief, not dread, just the same hollow numbness that had become his permanent state. But while they'd been away, playing at games and collecting meaningless crowns, the empire had been falling apart. The first signs of trouble reached them in Greece as whispers, easily dismissed. Some minor rebellions in Gaul, a provincial governor making noise, nothing to worry about. But the whispers grew louder, became reports, became alarming news. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, had declared Nero unfit to rule. He'd raised an army, called for the Senate to remove the emperor and choose someone else. Then Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, joined the rebellion, and he had legions behind him, real military force. Nero's first reaction was dismissive. "Rebellions happen. We'll crush them when we return to Rome." But more news kept coming. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who were supposed to be loyal to the emperor above all else, were wavering. Their commander, Nymphidius Sabinus, was making secret deals with Galba. The Senate, emboldened by Nero's absence and the military rebellions, was beginning to turn against him. The empire was in open revolt. Nero delayed as long as he could, unwilling to cut short his triumphant tour. But eventually, even he couldn't ignore reality. They had to return to Italy. The journey back was nothing like the journey out. No celebrations, no crowds cheering, just tense, hurried travel, everyone aware that they might be returning to civil war. When they reached Rome, the situation was even worse than reported. Legions were deserting. Provincial governors were declaring for Galba. The treasury was empty. Nero had spent it all on his entertainments and tours. The Senate met in emergency session, and in June of 68 AD, they did something unprecedented. They declared Nero an enemy of the state, hostis publicus, which meant he was no longer under the law's protection. Anyone could kill him without consequence. Nero's reign was over. The palace emptied almost overnight. Servants fled, guards deserted. Officials who had fawned over Nero just days before now vanished, afraid to be associated with a fallen emperor. Nero wandered through the empty corridors, calling for help that didn't come. Even his most loyal supporters were abandoning him, the rats leaving the sinking ship. But one person didn't leave. Sporus stayed, not out of loyalty, not out of love, but because he had nowhere else to go. No family, no home, no identity apart from being Nero's empress. He was chained to the emperor as surely as if there were actual iron shackles on his wrists. When Nero finally accepted that he had to flee, that Rome was no longer safe, he gathered a small group of servants and freedmen who were either too loyal or too foolish to abandon him. "We'll go to Phaon's villa," Nero decided. Phaon was one of his freedmen who had a property just outside Rome. "Hide there. Figure out what to do." They left in the middle of the night. The Emperor of Rome, reduced to fleeing his own capital like a criminal, and Sabina, Sporus, went with them. The ride to the villa was surreal. Nero, who had always traveled in grand processions with hundreds of attendants, was now on horseback with just a handful of people. At one point, they passed a group of soldiers who were putting up notices. Nero made the mistake of reading one. It was the Senate's declaration. Nero Claudius Caesar was an enemy of Rome, to be arrested on sight, to be executed in the ancient manner, beaten to death with rods. Nero's face went white. "They're going to beat me to death," he whispered, "like a common criminal." They reached Phaon's villa as dawn was breaking. It was a modest place, nothing like the palaces Nero was used to. They went inside and barred the doors. And then they waited. For what? Nero didn't seem to know. He alternated between panic and grandiose planning. "We could flee to Egypt. They love me in Egypt. Or Parthia, the Parthian king would welcome me. Or I could go before the people, make a speech, win them back." But reality was closing in. By mid-morning, they could hear horses in the distance, soldiers coming to arrest him. Nero pulled out a dagger. His hand was shaking. "I can't let them take me. I can't die like that. Beaten to death in the forum, but I can't." He couldn't do it. Couldn't bring himself to push the blade into his own flesh. His secretary, Epaphroditus, finally helped him, guided his hand, pushed the dagger into Nero's throat. Nero gasped. Blood poured from the wound. He looked at Sporus one last time, his eyes full of confusion and pain. "Qualis artifex pereo," he whispered. "What an artist dies in me." And then he collapsed. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors died on the floor of a freedman's villa, bleeding out while his wife watched. Sporus stood there, numb. He felt nothing, no grief, no relief, just emptiness. Nero was dead. The man who had mutilated him, transformed him, married him, made him into a living ghost, that man was gone. But Sporus's nightmare wasn't over. As the soldiers burst through the door, as they saw the emperor's body on the floor, one of them grabbed Sporus roughly. "You're coming with us. The new emperor will want to see you." Because Sporus, Sabina, the surgically altered boy who looked like a dead empress, was still valuable, still a symbol, still property to be claimed. Nero was dead, but the human doll still had to perform. They took Nero's body back to Rome for burial. They took Sporus too, but not for any ceremony. He was taken to a holding area, guarded, uncertain what his fate would be. The year was 68 AD, transitioning into 69, and Rome was about to descend into civil war. With Nero dead and no clear heir, multiple claimants emerged, generals backed by their legions, politicians backed by wealth. The empire, which had seemed so permanent, so stable, was suddenly fracturing. This period would be known to history as the Year of the Four Emperors. In just 12 months, 4 different men would claim the throne. 3 of them would die violently, and Sporus would belong to each of them in turn. Because that's what he was now, not a person, not even really a freedman anymore. He was a curiosity, a trophy, the physical embodiment of Nero's madness, which made him valuable to whoever wanted to claim Nero's legacy or mock it. He was property, to be taken, used, displayed, discarded. The first to claim him was Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and opened the gates for rebellion. Sabinus was an ambitious man who had helped engineer Nero's downfall. He'd promised the Praetorian Guard enormous bonuses if they'd switch their loyalty to Galba. They'd agreed, and Nero had fallen. But Sabinus wanted more than just a reward. He wanted power. He wanted to be emperor himself. And as part of his claim to Nero's legacy, he wanted Nero's empress. Sporus was brought before him just days after Nero's death. He was still wearing the mourning clothes they dressed him in for the funeral, black silk, his face painted with white ash in the Roman tradition. Sabinus looked him up and down, calculating. "You'll stay with me," he said. "Continue as you were. Dress as the empress. I'll need you for certain appearances." Sporus's heart sank. It was happening again. A new master, but the same role. "Yes, my lord," he said automatically. And so it began again. Sabina's household was reconstituted. The servants, the guards, the whole apparatus of maintaining the fiction. Sabinus wanted to present himself as Nero's legitimate successor, and having Nero's widow, however unconventional, was part of that claim. Sabinus even kept him dressed in Poppaea's jewelry, in feminine clothing, made him appear at functions, sit at his side during meetings, trying to evoke Nero's grandeur, to claim that mantle of power. But Sabinus's gambit failed. The legions had already declared for Galba, not him. And when Sabinus tried to rally the Praetorian Guard for a coup, they turned on him instead. He was killed by his own soldiers just 3 weeks after Nero's death. His mutilated body was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber, and Sporus changed hands again. Servius Sulpicius Galba was everything Nero wasn't. He was old, 73 years old when he became emperor. He was austere, military, rigid, a man who believed in discipline, tradition, and the old Roman virtues. He took one look at Sporus and was disgusted. "This is an abomination," Galba reportedly said. "Nero's perversion made flesh." But he didn't free Sporus, didn't let him go. Instead, he kept him as, what? Evidence, a trophy, a reminder of Nero's degeneracy. Sporus was housed in the palace, but isolated. No longer the empress, no longer given special treatment. Just a strange prisoner kept under guard, neither freed nor killed. It was a different kind of torture. Under Nero, at least Sporus had a role, a purpose. Now he was nothing, an object of curiosity and revulsion. Guards would stare at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Servants would whisper, He was kept in feminine clothing, not because anyone wanted him to be an empress, but because removing the clothes would require acknowledging what had been done to him. Easier to just keep him as he was, a living exhibit of Nero's madness. Galba's reign was brief. He was a reformer who tried to restore fiscal discipline and military order. But he was also old, inflexible, and deaf to political realities. The Praetorian Guard, angry that he refused to pay them the bonuses Sabinus had promised, turned against him. In January of 69 AD, just 7 months after taking power, Galba was assassinated in the Roman Forum, hacked to pieces by soldiers, and Sporus changed hands again. Marcus Salvius Otho had been Nero's friend, more than friend. They'd been close companions in Nero's younger years, partners in debauchery. Some ancient sources hint they might have been lovers, though that claim might just be hostile gossip. What's certain is that Otho loved luxury, spectacle, and all the pleasures Nero had indulged in. When Otho seized power by engineering Galba's murder, one of his first acts was to claim Sporus. "Bring me Sabina," he ordered. And suddenly, horribly, Sporus found himself back in the same role he'd played for Nero. Otho dressed him as empress, gave him back the household, the servants, the jewelry, made him appear in public at his side. It was like Nero had never died. Like the last 8 months had been a dream, and now he was back in the nightmare that had become his normal. Otho was kinder than Nero, perhaps, less obsessed. He didn't insist that Sporus was actually Poppaea, returned from the dead. He knew what Sporus was, a boy who'd been surgically altered to resemble a dead woman. But he liked the aesthetic, the perversity of it, the statement it made about his own power and disregard for convention. So Sporus wore the gowns again, appeared at dinners again, played the silent, beautiful ornament again. For 3 months it continued, and Sporus began to wonder if this was simply his fate, to be passed between emperors, forever playing this role, forever trapped as Sabina. But Otho's reign was even briefer than Galba's. He faced a challenge from Vitellius, a general commanding legions in Germania. They met in battle at Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho lost, and rather than flee or fight on, he chose to commit suicide, perhaps the most honorable thing he did during his short reign. He didn't want to prolong the civil war, so he fell on his sword. April of 69 AD. 3 emperors dead in less than a year, and Sporus changed hands one final time. Aulus Vitellius was a glutton. That's what history remembers him as. A man of enormous appetites, for food, for wine, for cruelty. He was also, unlike Otho, not an admirer of Nero's lifestyle. He saw Nero as a degenerate whose excesses had nearly destroyed Rome, and he saw Sporus as the ultimate symbol of that degeneracy. When Vitellius entered Rome and was shown the various treasures left behind by previous emperors, Sporus was among them. Vitellius looked at him with cold eyes. No admiration, no desire, just contempt. "This is what Nero did?" he asked his advisors. "Mutilated a boy to play dress-up with a dead woman?" "Yes, Caesar." Vitellius laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. Grotesque. Absolutely grotesque. For a moment, Sporus hoped that meant he'd be freed. If Vitellius found him disgusting, perhaps he'd simply let him go. But Vitellius had other plans. "The people need to understand how depraved Nero was," Vitellius said, "how far he fell from Roman virtue. And this creature, is the perfect demonstration." He turned to his advisors. "Plan a spectacle. The arena. We'll show the people exactly what their former emperor was capable of." Sporus's blood ran cold. The arena. That meant the Colosseum, or one of Rome's other public amphitheaters. That meant performance in front of thousands. "What kind of spectacle, Caesar?" an advisor asked. Vitellius smiled. "A mythological reenactment, something dramatic, perhaps the rape of Persephone by Hades, or Leda and the Swan, something that requires our little Empress here to play the maiden." The implication was clear. Sporus would be dressed as a woman and subjected to a public sexual assault as part of a theatrical performance, in front of thousands of jeering Romans, for their entertainment, to demonstrate Nero's depravity by continuing it, by using Sporus one more time as a prop. "Prepare it for the Colosseum," Vitellius ordered. "Make it grand. Spare no expense. The people will love it." Sporus was taken back to holding, his mind reeling. This was it. The final degradation. The ultimate humiliation. For years, he'd been violated in private. Nero's living ghost, playing dress-up in palace chambers and at state dinners. But this would be public. Thousands watching as he was assaulted on stage. His pain, his humiliation, his destruction turned into mass entertainment. Everything he'd endured, the surgery, the training, the wedding, the years of performance, all of it had been leading to this, to being a spectacle, a joke, a cautionary tale about the depths Nero had sunk to, demonstrated by continuing to use the very victim Nero had created. The preparations began. Sporus was shown costume designs, told which myth would be performed, given a schedule for when he'd need to be ready. Through it all, he was silent. What was there to say? Begging hadn't worked when Nero first decided to transform him. It wouldn't work now. But something was building inside him. Not rage. He'd felt no rage for years now, had been too numb for that. But something else. A decision crystallizing. He'd survived the surgery, survived the transformation, survived Nero's madness and Greece and 3 different emperors. He'd survived by being compliant, by playing the role, by submitting to whatever was demanded of him. But this public violation, this final humiliation, he couldn't survive, wouldn't survive. So he made a choice. The first real choice he'd made in 3 years. The night before the scheduled spectacle, Sporus requested a private meeting with his guards. He told them he needed to discuss his costume, his preparation, the logistics of the performance. They agreed. Why not? He'd been compliant this whole time. He was the good victim, the obedient ghost. He was given a few hours alone in his quarters to prepare himself mentally for the performance. The guards waited outside. Sporus stood in the center of the room, still wearing the silk gown they'd put him in, still wearing Poppaea's jewelry, still looking like the empress he'd been forced to become. He walked to the window and looked out over Rome. Somewhere out there, in that sprawling city, was the Colosseum. Tomorrow, thousands of people would gather there to watch him be degraded for their amusement. He thought about the boy he'd been, the freedman with a slave name who'd been running an errand through the palace, the boy who'd looked up and met an emperor's gaze and had his entire existence erased in that moment. That boy was gone, had died on a surgery table 3 years ago. What remained was this ghost, this hollow thing that wore silk and answered to Sabina. But even ghosts could choose. Even ghosts could say no. There was a vial in the room. Sporus had noticed it earlier. Medicine, probably, something the guards had left. But medicine in large doses could be poison. He didn't hesitate, didn't debate, didn't write a dramatic farewell. He simply took the vial and drank its contents. The poison acted quickly. Within minutes, his vision began to blur. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, the silk of his gown pooling around him. Pain radiated through his body, but it was distant, unimportant. This was pain with a purpose, pain that meant freedom. He could hear the guards outside, still talking, unaware. By the time they checked on him, it would be too late. His last conscious thought was not of Nero or Poppaea or any of the emperors who had used him. It was of himself, the boy with the slave name who had been erased, the boy who in this final moment was taking himself back. The ghost was finally disappearing, not into another performance, but into the darkness where no emperor could reach. They found his body at dawn, when a servant came to prepare him for the day's spectacle. The guards panicked. Vitellius would be furious. The grand performance he'd planned, the demonstration of Nero's depravity, ruined. But Vitellius, when informed, simply shrugged. "Dispose of it," he said. "Find something else for the afternoon's entertainment. No funeral, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that a person had died. Just disposal." Sporus's body was wrapped in plain cloth and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere outside Rome. The location was never recorded. The grave was never marked. Even in death, his identity was erased. The jewelry was collected and returned to the imperial treasury. Poppaea's gowns were put back in storage. The quarters were cleaned and reassigned. Within days, it was as if Sporus had never existed. The servants who had attended him were reassigned. The guards moved on to other duties. The city, consumed with civil war and the spectacle of changing emperors, forgot all about the boy who'd been Nero's ghost. History almost forgot him too. If not for the ancient historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, who recorded the story as an example of Nero's unprecedented depravity, Sporus would have vanished completely from the historical record. But they wrote it down. This bizarre, horrifying tale of an emperor who tried to resurrect his dead wife by mutilating a boy. And so Sporus survived, in a way, not as a person, but as a story, a cautionary tale, a historical curiosity. But here's what the historians didn't really capture: the years of daily humiliation, the psychological torture of becoming someone else, the complete erasure of identity, the passing between emperors like property, the slow death of the self that happened long before the physical death. They recorded the facts, the surgery, the wedding, the public appearances, but they couldn't convey what it felt like to live through it, to wake up every morning and look in the mirror and not recognize yourself, to speak with a voice that isn't yours, to answer to a name that belongs to a dead woman. They saw Sporus as a footnote to Nero's story, an example of how far the emperor had fallen. But Sporus was more than that. He was a person who had a life erased, a victim who found, in the very end, a single moment of agency. His death wasn't defeat, it was refusal. The human doll finally breaking free of its strings. The year 69 AD ended with Vespasian claiming the throne. He was the fourth and final emperor of that bloody year, and unlike his predecessors, he would establish a new dynasty, the Flavians, and bring stability back to Rome. By the time Vespasian entered Rome in triumph, Sporus had been dead for months. The story of Nero's Empress was already becoming legend. whispered in scandalized tones in dining halls and bathhouses. Did you hear what Nero did? He actually castrated a boy to make him look like his dead wife, married him, took him to Greece, absolutely mad. The story survived because it was so extreme, so shocking, so perfectly illustrative of Nero's descent into madness. But we need to be clear about what this story really is. This isn't a story about Nero's madness, not really. Nero is the villain, yes, but he's almost beside the point. Thousands of words have been written about Nero's psychology, his tyranny, his eventual downfall. He doesn't need more attention. This is Sporus' story, the boy who probably didn't even have a real name, just a slave name meaning scattered. The freedman who walked past a doorway at the wrong moment. The teenager who was surgically mutilated, psychologically destroyed and transformed into a living ghost. And in the end, who refused? Who said no? Who chose death over one final degradation? That choice matters. In a world where he had no power, no rights, no voice, where his body, his name, his entire existence belonged to whoever held the imperial throne, that final act of suicide was the only power he had left, and he used it. He denied Vitellius his spectacle. He denied Rome its entertainment. He denied them all the satisfaction of using him one more time. The ancient sources don't tell us much about Sporus' personality. We don't know if he was brave or frightened, clever or simple, what he dreamed about or hoped for. The historians only cared about him as an object in Nero's story. But from the bare facts we do have, we can infer something important. He survived longer than anyone could have expected. The surgery should have killed him. Infection, shock, or complications could have ended him on that table. The psychological trauma should have destroyed his mind. The years of performance, of living as someone else, should have broken him completely. But he endured. Day after day, month after month, year after year, he played the role, he survived, until he decided not to. And that decision, that final refusal, is what makes his story worth telling. Not as a footnote to Nero's madness, not as a historical curiosity, but as a testament to the human capacity for endurance and to the power of saying no, even when no is the last word you'll ever speak. Sporus died nameless. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His true identity was erased so completely that we'll never recover it. We don't know what his mother called him. We don't know what he looked like before the transformation. We don't know what he wanted from life. All we have is the slave name, Sporus, and the imposed name, Sabina, and the story of what was done to him. But maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering that he existed, that he suffered, that he endured, and finally refused. Maybe that's a kind of justice. Because the alternative is letting him disappear completely. Letting him be just a strange anecdote in Nero's biography. A historical curiosity. A joke about ancient Roman excess. He was more than that. He was a person. A boy who had his humanity stripped away, piece by agonizing piece, and who found a way, in the very end, to reclaim a shred of it. The ghost who refused to disappear completely. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's darkest stories. If you found value in this deep dive into the past, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep exploring these forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to know who's joining us on these journeys through the shadows of the past. This was the story of Sporus, the boy with a slave name who became an empress. the human who became a doll, the ghost who, in the end, chose to disappear on his own terms. Till next time, this has been the Midnight Archives.